It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Matt Warman, Labour MP Siobhan McDonough, Daily Mirror editor Alison Phillips and Daily Telegraph columnist and author of Whatever Happened to Tradition, Tim Stanley. Today, do we need to change course on COVID?
Relying on the vaccine programme to kind of take care of the problem is not going to be a solution, I'm afraid.
Ministers, scientists, experts are looking at data on an hourly basis, and we don't feel that it's the time for Plan B right now.
Michael Gove!
Anti-lockdown protesters are condemned for confronting Michael Gove in the street. A row between Poland and the EU draws this comparison.
By the way, it's exactly for the same reasons that the hard Brexiteers went out of the European Union.
And Boris Johnson faces Keir Starmer. We'll have Prime Minister's questions live at noon. Let's start with this headline in the Guardian newspaper. NHS chiefs urge Plan B plus amid COVID surge. You heard one of them saying that we can't just rely on the vaccine rollout and programme. Plan B would include compulsory face coverings in some settings, mandatory vaccine passports for mass events and asking people to work from home. So the question to all of you is, are they right? Matt?
Well, I don't think we're there yet. I think if you look at the 7-day average of deaths, for instance, it's below where it was last month. If you look at the pressure on the NHS, it's not what it was over the course of the summer. So it's right that Plan B exists as a backup. Of course it is. But the scientific consensus is not as sort of unanimous as it was. But I do think the predominant view is that we're not there yet and we need to be sensible. We need to rely on that vaccine programme. Everyone needs to get out there and get their boosters.
Siobhan?
I don't think we're implementing Plan A even before thinking about Plan B. The booster jabs are way behind schedule. It won't be till January till all the vulnerable groups actually get it. Kids in schools, I'm getting loads of emails about they're not having them because it's taking too long. I mean, why on earth have they gone back to school without them? In France, they did them back in July. So again, we're chasing to catch up. And why is it that on the tube, we're not enforcing the wearing of masks? So about a third of people are and 2/3 aren't. I think people will do it if they're required to do it.
Is there a sense of complacency, Tim, about some of the things that Siobhan has described? And to put it into context, yesterday the UK reported 223 COVID deaths. That's the highest for 7 months.
Complacency in everyday life, perhaps, because we're getting back to normal. We're almost completely there. And it doesn't feel as though the virus is as much as a threat as it used to be. Complacency among agencies and government, I'm not so sure that's fair. I think the litmus test is going to be the pressure upon the NHS. And I've always suspected that given the nature of winter, given that every year there seems to be a crisis in the NHS, it seemed inevitable to me from the summer onwards that we would return to some form of lockdown later this year. I think that would be a pity, not only because of the economic and psychological benefits, but also because we've invested so heavily in a vaccine. And some members of the public are going to ask themselves, if this vaccine works, if the boosters work, why are we having to go into another lockdown?
Right, Alison, and I hope your dog is obviously a fan of Politics Live. Tim, listening there very closely. Alison, listening to that, do you agree with Tim? Do you think some sort of lockdown is inevitable?
I don't think it's inevitable. And I mean, clearly, no one wants to get to that position again. But we are in a really, really difficult position at the moment. And the whole booster situation is incredibly disappointing. And I don't understand really how we've got to this point. So the idea that it's sort of the blame it feels yesterday was being cast on the public for being blasé and for not going to get their boosters. There's got to be that sense of national mobilisation that we had the first time around when people were rushing to get their vaccinations. And that cannot be just be blamed on the general public. We've got all sorts of issues, I think, as Siobhan said there. around people not wearing masks. I mean, there was many mistakes made as to why so many things why we had no masks in shops. That we could have avoided in the first place. And so now it'd be really, really upsetting if we go back to a situation again where we're behind the curve. We were so far ahead on vaccinations. We were leading Europe, we were leading the world. And now we're down the tables again in our numbers of people that have been fully vaccinated.
And Siobhan, I'll come to you in just a second, but those thoughts are reflected in some of the front pages. The Daily Express, booster jabs plea to keep Britain safe. And your paper, Alison, The Mirror, has our country needs a booster. Siobhan, just before I come to you, Matt, do you agree on that issue that we're not seeing the same urgency as there was first time round with getting the first and second vaccines?
Yeah, I think that is right. I think what the public is gradually seeing through the newspapers, through the media, is that urgency. And I think you will see both more communication from government and more uptake from the public. That's got to be a good thing. But it is what will keep us open. And I think that motivates people an awful lot.
Right. But should the government have done more on that already?
So I think we perhaps could have seen more strident communications from the government. But in practice, this is driven by the speed at which those boosters can get out there. So I think it is a little bit chicken and egg on some of this.
I think communication is key. I mean, I would urge the government to go back to having daily press conferences saying how far the vaccine had got, you know, to keep our concentration. I don't think the blame lies with the individual. I think the communication is poor. I think people need to know what progress there has been.
The daily press conferences, Tim, you were shaking your head.
Oh, heavens no, because as a journalist, I'd be obliged to watch them.
It's not all about you.
No, it's not all about me. A lockdown this winter will be a subtly different proposition, not just because of the vaccine, not just because psychologically people feel they've been through this, they feel deaths are down, they don't understand. It's also a different proposition because don't forget, we've been through queues for fuel. We have gas bills rising, we have supply shortages, and we have the threat of a winter that's possibly actually poorer than the year before. To ask people to go into that and to ratchet up again this sense of emergency and urgency, I suspect that this time around you would see consumer resistance in a way you didn't see last time, because people had enough.
Well, just to be clear, of course, we're not on the language front using lockdown in that sense. They're talking about Plan B, which wouldn't be the same as a lockdown. It would be taking those sorts of measures.
It includes forced working from home, and I believe it also includes the use of vaccine passports. So it is at least a halfway house to a lockdown. All right. At this time when people want to be with other people and socialising.
Let me just show you these pictures. You did see some of them in the headlines. Anti-lockdown protesters, that's Michael Gove, the Cabinet Minister, walking yesterday through Westminster. We've bleeped out some of the language that was used. He's quickly surrounded by a small group of protesters and also by the police. Quite difficult pictures to look at a time when we're talking a lot about the safety of MPs. What did you make of it, Alison?
Oh, it's just horrible to see this, and that's that level of aggression. And also these people, really, I mean, what are they protesting about, in all honesty? That we're so far from a lockdown at the moment. And when we're, as a nation, we need to be considering about how we're going to get people with booster jabs and all the young people that still haven't been vaccinated. That's the issue. So these people aren't really protesting about that. These are just people that are angry for all manner of reasons, and they want to go out and they want to be aggressive and they want to make threats to our democracy and to humiliate and undermine politicians. And they've just got to be policed in a very robust fashion.
Matt?
I think it's incomprehensible and offensive behaviour, but what is really problematic about it is it does raise some of those questions about how much protection should MPs need going about their daily business. No one wants to see a country where Michael Gove can't walk out and get lunch.
What about you, Siobhan? Do you feel for your safety?
Do you know, I don't, but I am very conscious I'm only one of 650 MPs, and many of them have been exposed to much more aggression than I have. What makes me worried is what made that group of people do that. I think during lockdown we have seen the radicalisation of all sorts of people through social media. So while protection of MPs is a discussion, it's not going to solve the real root cause of this. And I think we do have to look at regulating and policing social media in a much more robust way.
All right, well, we may be talking about that later on in the show. Tim, I mean, broadly speaking, these sorts of events and aggression towards cabinet ministers or MPs or politicians are pretty rare.
They are. It's totally unacceptable, though, and my heart actually goes out to MPs. The death of Sir David, which may well have been about radical Islamism, has nevertheless triggered a discussion about the context. The context is men and women who give up their life to serve other people. The 9/10 of them are very well motivated and do the best as they possibly can. And for that, they are persistently vilified and attacked upon social media. I'm not sure I agree with the proposals that some of them are cooking up to regulate that. But nonetheless, I think this is a moment to have this conversation about how we treat our elected representatives. And I can reassure them that 99% of the public, when they see those sorts of attacks, like has just happened upon Michael Gove, most of us are utterly disgusted.
All right, and a reminder, of course, in just over half an hour, we will have Prime Minister's questions, which we haven't had for a while because of conferences. On to something different, which is tensions running high in the EU Parliament in Strasbourg yesterday because of a dispute between Poland and the EU about the primacy of EU law. Let's have a listen.
I reject the language of threats and the fait accompli. I will not have politicians blackmail Poland. Blackmail must not be a method of contact with member states.
You know what it is. Article 1 is an ever closer union, and Article 90 is the central role of the European Court of Justice. By the way, it's exactly for the same reasons that the hard Brexiteers went out of the European Union, for these two articles.
The European democracy to function, there must be respect for common rules and principles, common institution and independent justice. Don't try to divert. That's the debate right now here about the rule of law and the primacy of European law. Don't try to run away and to escape that debate.
Strong words there yesterday in the Parliament, ending there with Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President. We can talk to Jessica Parker, the BBC's Brussels correspondent. Hello to you, Jess. This was just the latest flashpoint in a long-running war of words between Poland and the EU. What is the core issue?
Yeah, so you're right. This is the latest flashpoint, but seen as a very significant one. What happened earlier this month is that Poland's Constitutional Court ruled that certain EU treaty articles were incompatible with the national constitution. Now, this has been seen as a direct challenge to the primacy of EU law. That's really a bedrock of the bloc's legal framework. Mateusz Morawiecki, Poland's Prime Minister, came to the European Parliament yesterday. You got a flavour of how fiery the debate got at times, but he was basically arguing the ruling had been somewhat misunderstood, but there were examples of EU overreach in terms of rulings coming out of European courts' international law. And he also talked about blackmail. That's because of calls to withhold certain funds from Poland as a result of this. Ursula von der Leyen and others were arguing that, look, if you sign up to EU treaties, you have to stick by them. And I think there is a concern in Brussels amongst people, one diplomat I spoke to earlier, that this could set a dangerous precedent if it goes unchallenged. In terms of what's actually going to happen as a result of all of this, the Commission, the European Union's executive arm, is mulling that over, but a legal challenge, the possibility of withholding funds or even suspending member state rights from Poland, although possibly seen as a less likely outcome, those are all things being discussed.
Now, all this is being played out as there has been some talk about the prospect of Poland looking at leaving the EU. We saw actually pictures recently, we've shown them on Politics Live before, of people protesting in favour of the EU, of staying within the EU. Is it really a prospect of them leaving?
It's certainly a hashtag at the moment. Hashtag Polexit is one that you do see around. I haven't really spoken to anybody here who thinks it's a realistic prospect. Why? Well, for one reason, the governing Law and Justice Party aren't actually advocating it. Mateusz Morawiecki made that clear yesterday. He even pointed himself to polls which show a large majority of Polish people, it suggested, are in favour of remaining in the European Union. But there is this issue of a seeming divergence, at least between Poland's governing party and its supporters and the European Union, not just on legal issues, but also on social issues like LGBT rights as well. So there does seem to be this divergence that's causing concern. And it's interesting, we've heard today Poland is calling for a revision or postponement of an EU climate plan. So I think there is a concern that if the European Union does go hard in terms of trying to come back on Poland in terms of what's happening, could it just push a core member state further away on other issues? Angela Merkel, the outgoing German Chancellor, on Friday, though, was advocating a more conciliatory approach. And we have EU leaders meeting here in Brussels for the European Council in the next couple of days. Poland, I don't believe, and rule of law is officially on the agenda, but it's pretty likely to be discussed.
Thank you, Jess. Jess Parker there in Brussels. Matt, you heard the Belgian MEP Guy Verhofstadt comparing Poland's demands to those of the hard Brexiteers. Do you think that's a fair comparison, that he thinks Poland, like the UK, doesn't understand some key EU principles and rules?
Well, I think they do understand it, but that's the debate they want to have. It's actually to what extent is being a member state ceding some control? And this is a matter internally for the EU. The UK doesn't have a role in this. But I do think it is obvious that as the EU pushes that ever closer union point that Guy Verhofstadt made, that will increasingly mean that you see the conflict between what member states might see as their purview and what the EU thinks is in the interests of the whole bloc. Those tensions, I think, are only going to get more stressful.
So you do think that is a fair comparison, then?
I think it's a fair comparison. I think they're obviously in a very different place. And as Jess said a minute ago, there isn't a serious mainstream Polish argument that is currently getting mainstream support for the country to leave the EU. But the fact that those tensions are rising up the agenda, I think, is a really interesting point for the future of the EU.
Do you share Guy Verhofstadt's view?
No, not really, because Poland don't want to leave and the EU don't want them to leave. This is an argument about who holds the power. I mean, the Polish government does have issues about the rule of law and how it controls its courts and what it says to its judges. So there are some pretty illiberal things going on. And the EU has been, it's not only about economic union, it is about a set of social liberal values, which I think is at heart here. But I don't think either side will be forcing the other out anytime soon.
Tim, what do you think? Because in his speech last week, Lord Frost, the head of the UK's EU task force, said Poland was in a similar position to the UK in questioning the role of the European Court of Justice in national politics.
In that sense, it's similar, but politically it's very different because, as everyone has acknowledged, Poland isn't really going to go. And in that sense, right now, it probably has the EU over a barrel, because if it's not going to go, and if it can just ignore the EU and get away with it, then it gets the best of both worlds, doesn't it? It gets to stay in the EU, which most of its citizens want, without having to do the things it doesn't like to do. The EU can punish it by withdrawing some funds, but I have to say that over the years, Poland's got a lot more money out of the EU than it's put in. Now, I was very interested by the use of this word illiberal, because it gets to the heart of the problem here, which is that the EU started out, we all thought, as purely a trading zone, as an economic proposition. But of course, as you integrate and you get a constitution and you develop a political personality for Europe, it starts to become actually an institution which stands up for liberalism. In which case, what happens when individual member states are illiberal? What if they don't want to be part of that liberal project? They want the money, they want the trade, they want the free movement, but they don't want the social liberalism. That's the point at which the EU becoming a political project becomes difficult to sustain, because not everyone in Europe is on board with the EU's vision of what it means to be a good European.
Siobhan, picking up on something you said there, obviously.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, back in the distant past, you might recall that Tony Blair always held out to Turkey the possibility of Turkey becoming part of the EU, and he did that. He was motivated, trying to prevent or encourage the kind of ending of the Islamification of the state in Turkey and to keep more mainstream liberal views. So there has always been a political element to it. And I suppose you've all got to know what the rules of the club are and decide whether or not you want them.
Alison?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, everyone said there's a divergence of values here between the EU and what's been going on with the populist government in Poland. Whether a threat to withhold funds, significant funds for Poland, is going to change those values within the Polish government, I very much doubt. And that's why we're getting to this kind of ugly sort of words around blackmail. It's a crucial moment, though, for the EU, because if the threat of blackmail doesn't work, then where does that leave them? And they've got to seem to be strong here, because they've lost Britain, and they're kind of stumbling through that. If they were to lose more, even to have threats of losing more, it's making their whole viability a lot more at risk.
Right, and just before we move on, do you think it's sustainable then to have states like Poland within the EU when there are such clear differences on this issue of being liberal or not?
Well, it goes back to that point, really. I mean, as an economic union, you can survive. But where politics and culture and social issues become so, as they will do, so entwined with the economics, that's where it gets that much more complicated. All
right, we're going to move on. Let me just show you this headline in the Financial Times. London's Science Museum agrees sponsorship with arm of coal producer Adani Group. Announcement comes 2 weeks before the climate summit in Glasgow. It was yesterday it was announced that they'd signed this deal. Adani is a conglomerate with major holdings in coal and will sponsor the museum's new Energy Revolution gallery due to open in 2023. Climate activists have accused the Science Museum of jumping into bed with big coal by taking this sponsorship. It is from the green arm of Adani, and we're now joined by Dr. Chris Garrard from the group Culture Unstained, which campaigns to end fossil fuel sponsorship of culture. What's your problem, Chris, primarily with this sponsorship deal?
So Adani is one of the world's largest coal producers. It's behind the largest coal mine in Australia, which has been resisted by Indigenous communities on the ground. And we're less than a fortnight away from the COP26 climate summit. And Alok Sharma, the COP26 president, has said he wants to consign coal to history at that climate summit because it's the most polluting fossil fuel. Now, what the Science Museum has done is allowed Adani to attach its name to this exhibition about climate change, about energy transition, when actually it's doing the thing that's going in the opposite direction. It's potentially going to scale up its coal footprint by around 800%. So even though the museum is saying, oh, we're going to link up with the renewables part, actually Adani is one big company, and you can't choose the renewables part and completely ignore this massive involvement in coal, which is widely agreed that we need to shift away from. We've done it in the UK and we need to do it globally.
All right, just to apologise for the quality of your picture, Chris, but we can hear you perfectly well, so nothing for you to worry about. That's just for our viewers watching. Chris, the point is that these educational organisations, as you know, are often free, and they do have to find money from somewhere in order to survive. Isn't it better to be part of something like Adani, a fossil fuel, to educate on climate change?
The argument of this kind of financial necessity just doesn't add up. So Edinburgh Science Festival cut its ties to fossil fuel funding. The Nemo Science Museum in Amsterdam cut its ties to the oil company Shell just when our Science Museum was announcing a new sponsorship deal with Shell. So yes, there might be a role for corporate sponsorship, but there isn't a need to work with fossil fuel companies.
Right.
And right now, no oil or gas company, no fossil fuel company has their business on track to meet the Paris climate targets. So it's not a case of sort of debate or argument or opinion. That is the situation as it is. And we need to draw that ethical red line and compel them to act. And if they're not, they have no right to get any kind of social legitimacy by attaching their name to our respected museums.
All right, Chris, let me read you the response from the Science Museum Group director. It's quite long, bear with me. Trustees of the Science Museum Group are not convinced by the argument from some who say we should sever all ties with organisations that are tainted by association, direct or indirect, with fossil fuels. We believe the right approach is to engage, debate and challenge companies, governments and individuals to do more to make the global economy less carbon intensive. Adani Green Energy is an example of an energy sector business bringing expertise and investment to renewables at the scale needed to deliver meaningful change. Any company that wishes to work with the Science Museum Group has to accept that editorial control sits firmly with the museum. The deceitful innuendo from activists who try to suggest otherwise is an insult to our fine curators and the expert external advisors who support them. That's a message to you, Chris.
So we've heard this before from the Science Museum director. The reality is this is scientists, this is young people, this is visitors to the museum. There's a broad spectrum of people. And Professor Chris Rapley So a former director of the Science Museum and a leading climate scientist resigned from the museum's advisory board just a few weeks ago because he could no longer support the museum's stance on fossil fuel sponsorship. So the reality is that Ian Blatchford, the Science Museum director, is the one that's isolated and an outlier on this issue.
All right, Chris, stay with us. Tim, what do you make of what you've just heard?
I'm not unsympathetic. If you take the view that fossil fuels are akin to, say, tobacco, then even if a tobacco company were financing an exhibition that was about getting off tobacco, you'd still say, I don't want that money is tainted. Where I depart, however, is I think, first of all, that as with this company, fossil fuel companies are probably going to play a substantial part in going green, because going green costs a lot of money, and the initial investment in the technology and rolling it out is massive. And there's probably more advantage in encouraging fossil fuel companies and encouraging Gulf states and oil states to make that switch than there is trying to cut them out of the picture. Likewise, I also suspect that even when we do start to go green fully, we're still going to rely upon fossil fuels for some of our energy output. If nothing else, you need them for backup. So I just want to push back slightly against this idea that you can overnight make fossil fuels go away. You can not just stop using them, but you can also cut them out of the culture. I'm more sympathetic towards what I infer is the museum's position, which is let's engage with these companies, and by that engagement, encourage them to redirect their resources towards going green.
Chris?
International Energy Agency has said that if we're to meet the Paris climate target, so that's to try and keep global heating to a safe level below 1.5 degrees, there can be no new investment in oil, coal and gas from now. And Adani is scaling up its investment in fossil fuels. So while I appreciate what Tim is saying about transition, the reality is these companies are not part of the transition. They are still investing in looking for new oil, coal and gas. And you know, again, this isn't opinion, this is the International Energy Agency saying this, and these companies are still not shifting their business in the way we need them to. So one of the most straightforward steps is to draw that ethical red line and say, until you are doing that baseline, until you are doing what the Paris Climate Agreement that the world has signed up to is demanding, then you should not have a seat at the table. You should not be given the kind of badge of honour of having your name or logo on our trusted museums.
Tim, before I open it up?
I suspect what the museum might say in reply is, OK, so if we don't have this exhibit, we don't take that funding, Adani will probably still scale up its fossil fuel production. It just means that a good project doesn't get Adani's money. So as I say, if you cut fossil fuels out of the conversation, there's a risk that you just lock them out and you don't actually necessarily do any good for the good cause of going green.
Siobhan, where do you draw the line? If we just broaden it out for a moment, where do you draw the line on who or what is an acceptable sponsor? Tim made the sort of link between tobacco and pharmaceutical companies, perhaps. I mean, are fossil fuels really in the same bracket?
I was having this discussion with Matt before the programme started about where you draw the line, because I've been doing some work on getting a letter together from MPs and MP staff, because the parliamentary pension invests in Chinese companies. And for me, I don't see how we can do that at the same time as a number of MPs are on a list being banned from China, and as our speaker doesn't allow the Chinese ambassador in. And my motivation for doing that is I watched the video of the Uyghurs waiting for the train, and I thought, in my history book, I have seen this, and this is the Holocaust. So I, as the holder of a parliamentary pension, believe that I have a consumer right to do something about it, and I'm encouraging my colleagues to be part of that. And can I just say, one of the last political acts of Sir David Amess was to sign that letter.
Right, and we're going to come back to that in just a moment, but thank you for raising it, and you were obviously discussing it before. On the sort of principal question of where you draw the line and whether fossil fuel companies are so tainted in the minds of people, particularly of a museum that's opening a sort of, green revolution gallery, do you think that they count as a sort of off-limits
So I think ultimately it has to be a matter for the Science Museum to make up its own mind. These are rightly independent institutions. But I think in my own mind, it's very difficult to say that we shouldn't be, as the Science Museum said, engaging with companies like this, making sure that they are, as Tim said, part of that transition, because it does require huge resources.
Even if they're scaling up in the way that Chris has just said.
And I think there are two conversations to be had, aren't there? One is the association of the Science Museum and whatever they might want to do for an exhibition. The much more important conversation is what is the global activity that is being taken to stop companies scaling up in a way that everyone agrees is bad for the planet. And I think to entirely conflate those decisions is going to end up in some fairly muddled thinking. Should the Science Museum make up its own mind? Is it a good look? Perhaps it isn't. But ultimately, what would be far more important is to make sure that COP produces some of those results that mean that we are using less oil, less gas, that we are keeping temperature rises under control. That's what matters much more.
Where would you draw the line, Alison, on acceptable sponsors?
Well, I think it's the classic do the ends justify the means situation. And we all know that sometimes to get the change you want, you have to deal with people that you might not necessarily want to deal with. So to get to the position on renewables that we need to get to, yes, a lot of the big fossil fuel companies are going to have to be involved because, as Tim said earlier, they've got the clout, they've got the systems, they've got all that in place. However, do the ends justify the means when it's a situation about a new gallery, a new wing of a science museum in London? I don't think they do in this situation. And I think the Science Museum also has to be very conscious that this whole issue is still really ripe for people to point at it and say, oh, they're hypocrites, they're this, they're that. We're constantly seeing this. And they really have got the opportunity here to step away from it and to show that for the long-term future, that they're taking clean money for the clean industries.
And it's really hard to believe that there aren't alternative sponsors for a prestigious exhibition like this, isn't it, where companies are doing brilliant things.
Right, well, do you agree with that? Is it really hard to find sponsorship?
So I think it is hard. On the other hand, I think the idea that there is money to be taken from this industry, it is right that people benefit so long as there is no impact on the actual exhibition itself.
Chris, final word?
So we had this question of engagement, meaningful engagement, come up a few times. And in our research and investigation, we found out that the Science Museum actually signed effectively a gagging clause with its other fossil fuel sponsor, Shell. So if that claim of having meaningful engagement is true, you don't go and sign up to a gagging clause which is designed to protect the standing and the reputation of these fossil fuel companies. So that's really misleading of the Science Museum. The way to kind of compel these companies to act is not to give them that social license and kind of help clean up their image. We need to expose the reality of what they're doing, which is pushing us deeper into climate crisis. And that's how we're going to get the kind of transition we need. The Science Museum needs to be an advocate for climate science.
All right, and just to say, we haven't looked at the allegations that you have made, just as you mentioned them, but Chris Garrard, thank you very much for joining us. Let's just return to what Siobhan was talking about and show a tweet from you, Siobhan, on that issue of the pension fund. Horrified to learn from @HongKongWatch that the MP and MP staff pension funds may be invested in Chinese companies accused of complicity in gross human rights violations. 271 MPs, peers and staff urgently calling for this to change. Nobody can turn a blind eye. Have you signed up to this, Matt?
I haven't yet, but it's something that I'm very sympathetic to. I think what we clearly should be wary of is making investment decisions that are reflecting sort of personal positions. But when it comes to Chinese genocide, it's clearly beyond the pale. It's clearly, I don't think, something any member of Parliament would be seen to be wanting to support in any way whatsoever.
Right. Well, that's interesting when it comes to choices of investment, because you will remember the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, he did an interview with Bloomberg yesterday, and he was talking about Chinese investment. Let's just play you that clip. I think we can do so now.
I'm not going to tell you, John, that the UK government is going to pitchfork away every overture from China. Of course not. China is a gigantic part of our economic life and will be for a long time, for our lifetimes.
So where does that stand then, as the Prime Minister says he doesn't want to see a pitchforking away of Chinese investment when you are looking at certainly signing up to the idea that staff pension funds...
So I think the Prime Minister's making a separate but related point. Does any Member of Parliament want to support genocide? Of course they don't. No. Do we have to acknowledge that China is a major part of the global economy, that it is something that we have to engage with, and that investment both ways is something that is in our mutual interest? Of course we do. So I think that's why campaigns like this could potentially apply the sort of pressure if they are done properly, if there is the due diligence to make sure that we're not actually throwing out the baby with the bathwater, which is the fear that I think the Prime Minister quite rightly expresses.
Do you think they're consistent with each other, Alison?
Well, I think that we've seen what China's doing. There are major concerns, and we all have an ethical role to think about how investments that are made in our name and with our money are made. And I think that we're going to have to, as a society, think about what's the right thing to do with China going forward.
Tim?
We're discussing a number of moral propositions which have material costs. You want to go green, you're going to have to consume less and redistribute money to the developing world so that they can catch up. You want to resist the communist dictatorship in China. You're going to have to trade less with China and be far more strategic in your economic relationship with them. That's no comment, by the way, upon the Chinese people or the Chinese civilization. I hate the dictatorship. I think it's vile. And like the South African apartheid regime in the 1970s and 80s, I think it's time for Westerners to really check their moral compass and take a real stand on this issue.
All right, we're going to just show you this headline, BBC News story related to Sir David Amess, the Conservative MP who was killed nearly a week ago. The priest tried to give last rites to dying MP. Now, this was the news that the priest tried to get to Sir David Amess to read his last rites. He was turned away because Essex police said it was critical to protect the integrity of a crime scene and to allow emergency services to attend those in need, adding that access to the scene is at the discretion of investigating officers. Tim, you've written about this in the Telegraph. What were you saying?
That's their explanation, and I don't want to comment upon the specific circumstances because you don't know what they were. Nonetheless, as a general rule, what I would say is that to Catholics, the priest is an emergency service. But the last rites that the priest gives help to guide a soul into heaven. And whether you believe in it or not, the key thing is it gives comfort to the dying and to their relatives. It would be a little like saying at a crime scene that a relative can't come in. So what I would like to see, if guidelines don't exist, and according to the College of Policing right now, there are no guidelines on what to do in these specific circumstances, I think the guidelines need to be written. Why? Because in the past, I suspect that this point was well understood by the police, and they probably would have waved someone through the barrier because it was part of the culture. But now that Christianity really is a minority faith, as in faith is a minority pursuit, and given that we can't rely upon the religious literacy of police officers, I think it's time to teach what the last rites are and for there to be clear guidelines so that in a situation like this, no Catholic is denied what ultimately is a human right, which is the expression of their religion.
Matt?
I agree with Tim, absolutely, that there should be guidelines on this sort of thing.
It's interesting that there aren't guidelines.
It is, I think, surprising in some ways that there aren't guidelines. But I suppose the counterpoint I would make is that no one would want to see a situation where, for whatever reason, a trial were declared void or whatever because a crime scene had been contaminated, if I can use that word. So I think it is an immensely difficult decision. Ultimately, we all want to see justice done, and there has to be a balance to get there.
Siobhan?
I don't blame that individual police officer.
No.
I'm sure they just didn't know. But if you're a Catholic, you want your family members, you yourself want the last rites, and it's completely impossible to believe that it would be somehow the child would be jeopardised by a priest going in to give the last rites. And I hope the College of Policing or whoever will come out with guidance and people will understand how important it is.
Alison?
I take the point about the guidelines, but I think isn't what we would really want in this situation, just for people who are on the ground, who are given responsibility as a police officer, to feel that they've got that personal responsibility and they can show humanity in a situation like that. I mean, probably the reason that priest wasn't allowed in then, when they may have been 10, 15, 20 years ago, is that there's so many rules that are already in place. And yes, you have to protect a crime scene against contamination. But in that situation, you do feel there couldn't have been any harm done by a priest going in. And what I think we need is just more humanity and more decision-making by people on the ground, rather than laying on more and more and more rules and regulations that they then have to consult in a situation such as this.
Tim?
I think I agree with that. I just think guidelines might help so that the individual officer can then make a choice. As I said, I don't want to prejudge the circumstances because, for instance, last rites cannot be given after someone has died, and it's possible Sir David had actually died. But I'd also just add this is not just about policing, it's also about hospitals and particularly hospices. I know so many priests who get a phone call to say, please come and give the last rites, and the person has already died. And it's again comes back to a lack of religious literacy. I don't expect everyone to understand my faith, but people who have to deal with people in those situations, who have to deal with someone who's about to die, if they're a member of a public service, I think they should be taught about what the last rites are so that they can show that humanity and do the right thing.
Right, well, I'm afraid I have some disappointing news for you on a different subject, Tim, which is Laura Kuenssberg, the BBC's political editor, has just tweeted this. We haven't had a COVID press conference for a while. They will be one this afternoon. Siobhan, there you go.
Yeah, they listened to me.
They listened to you. They listened on Politics Live, and here it is. Don't expect government to move to its Plan B that we were discussing at the very beginning for England, but expect more of these kinds of messages. And underneath, I should say, is the Chief Medical Officer for England, Professor Chris Whitty, outlining some of the things that Matt was saying that the government will probably push for. Vaccination, now is the time. If you've been offered a booster, please take up the offer. Ventilation, masks in crowded indoor spaces and hand washing remain important. In a few minutes' time, PMQs will be starting. We'll show you the chamber. There it is. It's beginning to fill up, of course. Far more MPs. In fact, we've had a pretty full chamber. It will be sombre, though, today because of Sir David Amess, and also the news just over a week ago that James Brokenshire, another Conservative MP, died of lung cancer. Very sadly, there'll be no doubt tributes paid to him too. Before we go, though, over to PMQs, let's have a look at this in BBC News. Inflation, rise in cost of living slows in September. It's still pretty high, 3.1% on average over the past 12 months. What are your fears for cost of living crisis this winter?
Well, obviously, this is good news. It does indicate that the Bank of England was right to suggest that inflation wasn't going to go up for as long as some people had feared. But we are seeing, whether it's fuel, whether it's a host of other things, we are seeing some worrying increases. At the moment, I think it's very much a watching brief, but we do need to make sure that all of those issues that play into it are taken into account. And that's obviously what the Chancellor will be looking at when it comes to the budget as well.
Well, and the spending review next week, of course. But the Bank of England does still think that that figure could rise above 4%. I mean, that is the highest we've had in a very long time, and remain high until spring.
And it is a concern, and that's why I know the Chancellor will be thinking, what is it in the budget, what is it in the spending review that the government can do to alleviate some of that. I think that's, of course, the right thing for government to be thinking about, but taking into consideration the Bank of England's view that this is a relatively short-lived thing rather than a long-term trend.
Siobhan?
Rising fuel costs, rising food costs. It's a very difficult time, and for families who have the lease with the £20 cut in universal credit, it's going to be a really hard, long winter.
What would you like the government to do?
Well, I'd like it to reinstate the £20 on the universal credit. I think we need to look at, the poorest people live in the coldest houses, they spend their money more, so more money is spent on fuel, more money is spent directly on food in their local community. So any investment on people who don't have a lot produces more in a local area because they haven't got the money to save.
Tim, it's been a while since we've talked regularly about sort of inflation and rising cost of living.
I fear it's not a short-term thing, but a long-term thing, and it's down to structural problems. You have a squeeze on labour supply, which will drive up costs. You have a problem with the distribution of goods as a consequence of COVID, as the world bounces back and it struggles to keep up with orders. But also don't forget that come April, several taxes are going to go up, council tax, national insurance. And I wouldn't rule out the possibility of an interest rate rise, which will be good for savers, but obviously bad for many other people in the economy. So I think this is a long-term consequence of COVID, but also just things that aren't very healthy about the economy. And I don't think it's entirely honest to say it's short-term.
Right, not entirely honest, Matt.
Well, I think that's the Bank of England's judgment, not my judgment.
What's your view? Because obviously you're watching these things too all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tim is right to say that labour supply is obviously going to be a challenge into the future. You've seen the Home Office make some changes to that to try and move, as we move into that higher wage economy that the Prime Minister has talked about, trying
But
to
we also heard at
alleviate
conference
some of
that
those
could
stresses.
take 5 years or so. In the meantime, next April, those taxes are going up.
Well, and I think, of course, it is about the government's role is to try and mitigate some of those changes. But that move to a higher wage, more productive economy is ultimately the best one that we can make.
But our elderly people and our disabled people won't be able to wait 5 years. I went to a residential home in the constituency on Monday that was celebrating its 25th anniversary, and they told me about the terrible time they were having in trying to staff the rotas, making sure that people were cared for. Today there was a report on the news that people who provide care in people's homes were having to decide how bad people had to be before they would give the care, because they just didn't have the staff to do it.
Alison? Oh, sorry.
Well, I was going to say all the more reason it's good news that the Prime Minister has made those changes around social care. Getting some of those jobs done is hugely important now rather than to wait.
Alison?
Social care is still an enormous crisis, both in terms of the provision and also the staffing. That across the board, the labour shortages are only going to be pushing prices up for everyone. Our readers are really worried about what's ahead this year, and with the rising energy bills as well, plus the universal credit cut. People are really worried about a very long, cold winter.
Right, interest rates rising again. Have we got too used to interest rates being at record lows, Tim?
Yeah, we probably have, and it's not been good for savers either. Look, I don't just knock the government. There are some good things it's doing, like its reform on nursery care to say that people can look after more kids. And by the way, one really serious cost of living crisis is the cost of looking after kids as well as older people in this country. But I just feel it feels like we're about to hit a brick wall of reality. My mother's fuel bill doubled over the summer, and she's not using her heating. She's going to start using her heating. That's going to be a story up and down the country. Add on tax rises to that in the new year. I really think life's going to get quite tough for people. At the same time as the government saying we've got to do more to go green, I'm not against that, but there are costs involved. Yeah, there's going to be a £5,000 or so subsidy on installing a hydrogen pump, but they can between £10,000 to £20,000.
All right, we're going to have to stop you there, Tim, because it's time for Prime Minister's questions. Thank you to my guests.
In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Rachel Busker.
David Amos and James Brokenshire were both tragically taken from us. Both served this place with integrity and served their constituents well. And as we offer our heartfelt love and prayers to their families have offered us a new path to a new politics built on kindness and love. Mr. Speaker, Sarah Everard and Claudia Lawrence were both from York. And right now, women are feeling unsafe. Many women are unsafe. And the very people that should be protecting us are telling us to engage with potential perpetrators to identify them, to flag down a bus, or to know the laws of arrest better. Confidence in the police has taken its toll. But as women, we are confident and determined to change this. So every girl and every woman can live at home without fear, can go to school or work without harassment, can go online without objectification, and can walk our streets safely again. What steps will the Prime Minister take to ensure women with lived experience can lead on this work, and by when?
Prime Minister.
I thank her very much for her question, and she raises a most important issue, Mr. Speaker, one of the most important that this country faces. And I want all people in this country, particularly women, to feel confident in our police force, and I believe that they can and that they should. And what we're doing now to make sure that women in particular feel safe at night is we're investing in safer streets, in better street lighting, in more CCTV, But what we also have to do, Mr. Speaker, as I think the whole House understands, is ensure we deal with the systemic problems in the criminal justice system to ensure that men, and I'm afraid it is almost always men, get prosecuted for rape and for crimes of serious sexual and domestic violence in the way that they should, and that we secure the convictions that we should, Mr. Speaker, and that when we secure those convictions, those individuals get the tough sentencing that they deserve, Mr. Speaker, and that's what this side of the House believes in.
Luke Hall. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having a prematurely born child in neonatal intensive care means that for families every day can be a struggle, practically, financially and emotionally. Trying to continue with life as normal whilst racked with worry and a guilt that simply never leaves you is just not possible. That's why the Prime Minister's commitment to deliver neonatal leave and pay for parents in this situation is so important. So will the Prime Minister meet with me to discuss how quickly we can put this through Parliament so parents are getting this support as quickly as possible?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I will make sure that my honourable friend has the relevant meeting as fast as we can organise it. And I know that many parents, particularly those who have premature and sick babies, feel that the current system isn't working well for them. And that's why I can tell my honourable friend we will legislate to allow parents of children in neonatal care to take extended leave. Details of this policy were published last year, and we will bring forward the legislation as soon as possible.
We now come to Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I pay tribute to Ernie Ross, a formidable campaigner who served this place and his constituents with great distinction for 3 decades. Mr. Speaker, I will pay my respects and tribute to James Brokenshire immediately after this Prime Minister's questions. Can I thank the whole House for the way the tributes to Sir David were handled on Monday? We saw the best of this House, and I want to see if we can use that collaborative spirit to make progress on one of the issues that was raised on Monday, tackling violent extremism. It's 3 years since the government promised an online safety bill, but it's not yet before the House. Meanwhile, the damage caused by harmful content online is worse than ever. Dangerous algorithms on Facebook and Instagram and Hope Not Hate have shown me an example of violent Islamism and far-right propaganda on TikTok. What I was shown has been reported to the moderators, but it stayed online because apparently it didn't contravene the guidelines. I have to say I find that hard to believe. So will the Prime Minister build on the desire shown by this House on Monday to get things done and commit to bring forward the second reading of the online safety bill by the end of this calendar year? If he does, we'll support it.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman for the spirit in which he has approached this issue, and I echo what he says about the need for cooperation across the House, because the safety of MPs, indeed of all public servants, everybody who engages with the public, is of vital importance, and the online safety bill is of huge importance to, it's one of the most important tools in our armoury. And what we're doing is ensuring that we crack down on companies that promote illegal and dangerous content, and we'll be toughening up those provisions. But, Mr. Speaker, what we are also going to do is ensure that the online safety bill does complete its stages before this House, before Christmas. And I'm delighted, or rather, that we do bring forward bring it forward before Christmas in the way that he suggests. And I'm delighted, Mr. Speaker, that he is offering his support, and we look forward to that.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister. I think from that, and this isn't a challenge, it's to clarify that the pre-legislative scrutiny will be finished in early December, and that the second reading could, I think, be before the end of this calendar year. But we do need to get on with this. Telegram has been described as the app of choice for extremists. And, Mr. Speaker, if you can believe it, if the House can believe it, as we were paying tribute to Sir David on Monday, Telegram users could access videos of murders and violent threats against politicians, the LGBT community, women and Jews, as we were paying our respects. Some of these posts are illegal, All of them are harmful, and Hope Not Hate and the Board of Deputies have said that Telegram has, in their words, facilitated and nurtured a subculture that cheerleads for terrorists. Tough sanctions are clearly needed. Yet, under the government's current proposals, directors of platforms failing to crack down on extremism would still not face criminal sanctions. Why is that?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it is this government that brought forward an online harms bill, Mr. Speaker, and he's heard what I've said. He's heard what I've said about the second reading before Christmas, and in the collegiate spirit in which he announced he began his questioning, I can tell him that we will continue to look at ways in which we can toughen up those provisions and to come down hard on those who irresponsibly allow dangerous and extremist content to permeate the internet. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted that he's taking this new tough line, and I very much hope that he will get the rest of his party in the lobbies with us to join him.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I did start in a collegiate spirit, and I'll continue in a collegiate spirit because I listened hard to what was being said on the opposite benches on Monday about the concerns about this issue. And we do need to recognise the measures in the bill, but we do need tough and effective sanctions, and that means criminal sanctions. And that does matter, Mr. Speaker. It is frankly beyond belief that, as the Mirror reported yesterday, 40 hours of hateful content from Anjem Choudhury could be easily accessed online. The Prime Minister and the government could stop this by making it clear that directors of companies are criminally liable for failing to tackle this type of material on their sites. We don't need to delay, so in the collaborative spirit we saw in this House on Monday, will the Prime Minister commit to taking this away, looking at it again, and working with all of us to strengthen his proposed legislation?
Prime Minister.
Speaker, I've already said that we're willing to look at anything to strengthen the legislation. I've said that we're willing to bring it forward, and we will bring it forward to second reading before Christmas. And yes, of course, Mr. Speaker, we will have criminal sanctions with tough sentences for those who are responsible for allowing this foul content to permeate the internet, Mr. Speaker. But what we hope for also is that no matter how tough the proposals we produce, that the opposition will support it.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, we're making progress. We've got the second reading committed to before Christmas. That is a good thing. And I think the Prime Minister is now committed to criminal sanctions. At the moment, they're a fallback position at the discretion of the Minister. They should be, in my view, on the face of the bill as the automatic default for the failure to act. Now, if we're making progress on that, then we're beginning to address some of the issues that were identified across the House on Monday. Yep. Can I turn to the report, the Commission for Countering Extremism, which was set up in the wake of the horrific Manchester bombings? 8 months ago, that Commission made recommendations to plug gaps in existing legislation and strategy, gaps that extremists have been able to exploit and are continuing to exploit. Yet Sir Mark Rowley, formerly head of our counter-terrorism policing, who led on those recommendations, said just this week, "I've had no feedback from the Home Office on their plans in relation to our report on the absence of a coherent legal framework to tackle hateful extremism." Given the seriousness of the matter and the clear need for action, why has the government not responded to this important work? And will the Prime Minister now commit to act swiftly on the Commission's recommendations?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the government, and my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, works with all parties to tackle violent extremism, and the UK has one of the strongest counter-terrorism and counter-extremism systems in the world, as a consequence of which we have foiled 31 terrorist plots since 2017. And I pay tribute to the work of Sir Mark Rowley, with whom I worked extremely closely while I was in London, and all those who are involved in foiling those terrorist plots. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that they will receive the complete support of this House and of this government, nor will we allow them to be released, or those who are convicted, to be released early from prison, Mr. Speaker, because that was one of the most important things this government passed and which that party opposed.
Keir Starmer.
Really? After the week we've just had, I really don't want to descend to that kind of knockabout. Mr. Speaker, either we take this seriously, and I'm taking my lead from those on the opposite benches on Monday and what they were saying about the need to tackle this. Either we take it seriously and go forward together, or we do a disservice to those that we pay tributes to. There are clearly problems with the government's counter-extremism strategy. Internet users are increasingly likely to come across extremist content online. The government's own independent reviewer has said that there is no evidence that the government's key de-radicalisation programme is effective. That's the government's independent reviewer saying that. And we've seen a spate of lone attack killings with the perpetrator invariably radicalised online. We all want to stop this across this House, but at the moment things are getting worse, not better. So what urgent plans does the Prime Minister have to fix these glaring problems?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm all in favour of collegiate and cooperative approach, and then in which case I think it would be a fine thing if the opposition would withdraw their opposition to our measures to stop the early release of serious extremist and violent offenders. That's all I'm trying to say. In a collegiate approach, and I'm sure that is what the people of this country would wish to see. But we will continue to do everything that we can to strengthen our counter-terrorism operation and to support all those who are involved in keeping us safe. And obviously it is too early to draw any particular conclusions from the appalling killing of our colleague, but we will draw all relevant conclusions from that investigation.
Kuenssberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The inescapable desire of this House on Monday to finally clamp down on the extremism, the hate and the abuse that festers online is incredibly welcome. But closing down anonymous accounts would not have prevented the murder of Joe Cox, nor of PC Keith Palmer, and although we don't know the full circumstances surrounding his death, nor would it have saved Sir David. If we're to get serious about stopping violent attacks, we need to stop online spaces being safe spaces for terrorists. We need to ensure that unaccountable, arrogant social media companies take responsibility for their platforms. We need to end the delays, get on with the legislation and clean out the cesspit once and for all. Mr. Speaker, I've prosecuted terrorists and I've prosecuted extremists. I've worked with Sir Mark and others. Dozens of Labour MPs have worked hard on tackling social media companies on these issues. I started collegiately and I'll continue collegiately. We know what it takes. We can help. So will the Prime Minister now capture the spirit that we've seen this week and agree to work with us on a cross-party basis so that we can tackle violent extremism and its enablers together?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to join the right honourable gentleman in committing to tackling online harms together, to tackling violent extremism together, and that is what the government is doing, and that's why we brought forward the online harms bill. That's why we're investing record sums in tackling counter-terrorism. But, Mr. Speaker, I must say that what I think the whole country and the whole House would certainly want to see, in addition, if I can say this to the right honourable gentleman in a collegiate spirit, in addition, is a commitment by the Labour Party in future to support measures and not to allow the early release of those terrorists and those who are convicted of those offences from prison. And if we could hear that from the Labour Party, I think it would be a fine thing.
Crispin Blunt.
Mr. Speaker, knowing my right honourable friend's commitment to UK bioscience and his understanding of the exciting potential for improving mental health treatments for conditions such as depression, trauma and addiction, will he cut through the current barriers to research into psilocybin and similar compounds so the British public receive, and British science research and British pharmaceutical companies enable the potential treatments into these most debilitating conditions to be delivered at the earliest possible opportunity?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, I know, who has a very active interest in this in this area. What I can say to him is that we will consider the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs' recent advice on reducing barriers to research with controlled drugs such as the one he describes, and we'll be getting back to him as soon as possible.
We now come to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I join with the Leader of the Opposition in sending condolences to the family of Ernie Ross. Mr. Speaker, in 11 short days, world leaders will gather in Glasgow for COP26. This is our best chance, and very likely our last chance, to confront the climate emergency faced by our planet. That is why it was such a devastating blow that on the eve of COP26, this UK government rejected the Scottish cluster's bid to gain Track 1 status for carbon capture storage. Today's Press and Journal have said there is no valid reason and no acceptable excuse for this decision, and have called for a U-turn on this colossal mistake immediately. We know this decision wasn't made on technical or logical grounds. This devastating decision was purely political. Scotland's North East was promised this investment in 2014. It is a promise that has been broken time and time again. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister finally live up to those promises, or are they simply not worth the Tory election leaflets that they are written on?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we remain absolutely committed to helping industrial clusters to decarbonise across the whole of the country, and of course including Scotland. And I know that I know that there was disappointment about the Acorn bid in Aberdeen, and that's why it has been selected as a reserve cluster, Mr. Speaker. But there could be no more vivid testimony to this government's commitment to Scotland, or indeed to fighting climate change, that the whole world is about to come to Scotland, Mr. Speaker, to look at what Scotland is doing to help tackle climate change. And I congratulate the people of Scotland on their efforts.
Ian Blackford.
Mr. Speaker, people across Scotland are looking for answers today, and they're getting none. All they see is yet another Tory broken promise. It's bad enough that this UK government is holding back caption culture in Scotland, but across the board they are proving an active barrier to renewable energy opportunities. Tidal stream energy has the potential to generate 20% of UK generation capacity, exactly the same, Prime Minister, as nuclear. All this industry needs is a ring-fenced budget of £71 million, a drop in the ocean compared to the £23 billion that this government is throwing at the nuclear plant in Hickney. But the UK government are failing to give this support, threatening shovel-ready projects like Maygen in the north of Scotland. So at the very least today, Prime Minister, stand up and guarantee a ring-fenced budget for tidal stream energy and save this renewable industry from being lost overseas.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, actually, I congratulate the right honourable gentleman on raising tidal energy. He's absolutely right. I've seen the amazing projects that are underway, and we're certainly we're looking at finance. We're putting huge sums, I think the House will acknowledge, into clean, green energy generation. And he's far too gloomy, Mr. Speaker, about the prospects of Acorn in Aberdeen. I think he needs to be seized with an unaccustomed spirit of optimism, because actually the Acorn project still has strong potential, and that's why it's been selected as a reserve cluster. And he should keep hope alive, Mr. Speaker, rather than spreading gloom in the way that he does.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman and the new quiet man of British politics. Long may it continue. The weekend before last, I went to sea with the Brixham trawlers, and Brixham Fish Market is now turning over £1.4 million a week. They're looking forward to their share of the Levelling Up Fund, but they're also looking forward to the previously announced £100 million fisheries and seafood scheme. When will we be seeing that Pillar 2 and 3 launch, and will the Prime Minister reaffirm his commitment to our coastal communities and our fishing sector?
I thank my honourable friend for what he's doing for fishing and for the coastal communities and for Brixham in particular. I understand the fish market in Brixham was outstandingly successful the other day. And what we're going to do is make sure that we continue to support fishing and the seafood business across the country. And the scheme has approved funding in Brixham, in Salcombe and in Dartmouth, Mr. Speaker, and a further £100 million is being made available through the UK Seafood Fund to support our fisheries.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Lefarydd. If COP26 is to be successful, people must be at the heart of our net zero mission. For too long, the UK economy has left too many people behind, with wealth and investment hoarded in the southeast of England. Devolving powers over the Crown Estate would bring £500 million worth of offshore wind and tidal stream potential under Welsh control. Assets, of course, currently controlled by Westminster. Scotland, meanwhile, already has these powers. Will he support my bill to devolve the management of the Crown Estate to Wales?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as she already knows, the Crown Estate works closely with the Welsh Government and with natural resources in Wales, and I'm sorry to have to tell her that my view is that the Crown Estate in Wales, the devolution of the Crown Estate in Wales would fragment the market, complicate existing processes and make it more difficult for Wales as well as the whole of the UK to move forward to net zero.
Brendan Clark-Smith.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Delivering new homes is key to levelling up, as is putting that power in the hands of local people and making sure we build the right number in the right places. But my constituents, especially in Thievesdale and Ordsall, are concerned about over-intensive developments in our local plan. Will the Prime Minister confirm that the minimum housing requirement for Bassetlaw is 4,896 and not the 10,000 as claimed by the Labour-run council?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not surprised to say that my honourable friend is completely right. And this government is determined to give the people of this country the homes that they need. We're building record numbers of homes, but we owe it to our kinder, gentler politics, Mr. Speaker, to be accurate about what is going on in our constituencies. And this government does not set local housing targets. And I understand that the draft Bassetlaw local plan is subject to consultation. I would encourage him and his constituents to make their views known.
Kirsten Oswald.
Mr. Speaker, tomorrow at 2:50 p.m, my constituency will fall silent as we mark exactly 50 years since Scotland's largest peacetime explosion ripped through Clarkston Toll in East Renfrewshire. 10 shops were demolished by the ignition of gas which had escaped from a fractured gas main beneath the shops. A passing bus was caught up in the blast. 22 people died, mostly women, and over 100 were injured. Tomorrow, 50 years on, the community and families will come together for a memorial service. So will the Prime Minister join me in acknowledging the terrible losses that many families locally suffered and the continuing sorrow in the community, and in reflecting that the victims of the Clarkston disaster must never be forgotten?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable lady for raising this anniversary, and she's right to commemorate the victims of the Clarkston disaster, and our thoughts and our condolences continue to be with the families of those who lost loved ones, and of course we must do everything in our power to make sure that no such tragedy is repeated.
Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The failings of Greater Manchester Police, which have led to it being placed in special measures, are well documented, including the failure to record 80,000 crimes in a single year, and those included domestic violence and sexual offences. But it's particularly important that the force addresses what a recent Manchester Evening News investigation called its culture of denial and secrecy. After the horrific murder of Sarah Everard, it's crucial that we tackle the cover-up culture. Will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, therefore join me in calling for Greater Manchester Police to urgently review its internal culture, and also will he consider reforming the law on whistleblowing so people in Greater Manchester Police and other organisations can speak up against wrongdoing in confidence?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, it's vital that people should have the confidence to speak up against wrongdoing wherever they find it, particularly, of course, in the police. I do believe that the people of Greater Manchester deserve better. I support and agree with what my honourable friend says. I would just say one thing, Mr. Speaker. It is the responsibility of the Mayor of Greater Manchester to ensure that the police force acts, not a point that I hope will be taken up on the benches opposite, to ensure that the police force acts swiftly and decisively to address the failures that his constituents are currently finding.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to join colleagues in paying tribute to the Honourable Member for Southend-on-Sea. He was a good friend and an esteemed parliamentarian. I also wish to pay tribute to the Right Honourable Member for Old Bexley and Sidcup. He served this House and country assiduously and will be missed by members across the House. Mr. Speaker, heating bills, food shops, and fuel costs are all rising at a staggering speed. This winter, millions of families on universal credit will be forced to choose between eating or heating. Given the crisis in living costs we are now facing, will the Prime Minister reconsider his scrapping of the universal credit uplift and reinstate the £20 a week lifeline he has just taken away?
Mr. Speaker, what we're doing is ensuring that we keep costs of heating down with the price cap. We've increased the winter the warm homes allowance by £150 for 780,000 homes, and we've just given local councils another £500 million to help poorer families over the winter. But the most important thing that's happening, Mr. Speaker, in this country is that wages are going up. And there is a huge jobs boom now in this country, thanks to the policies that this government has pursued.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure my right honourable friend would agree with me that homeless people should be assisted and not arrested. The review of the repeal of the Vagrancy Act 1824 has now been concluded. Does my right honourable friend agree with me, therefore, that it is now time that the amendments to the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Bill, which are being considered in the other place, should be adopted so that we can consign the Vagrancy Act to the history books forever, but give the police the powers they need to combat trespass, aggressive begging and other antisocial behaviour?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is a passionate campaigner on this issue, and he's done a lot of good things in this area. No one should be criminalised simply for having nowhere to live, and I think the time has come to reconsider the Vagrancy Act, Mr. Speaker, but also to redouble our efforts to fight homelessness, as I think we've done successfully over the pandemic, but must continue to do.
Gillian Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. University Hospitals, Coventry and Warwickshire NHS Trust has dealt with more than 600 attacks on staff during the pandemic. To deter further attacks, staff in the hospital's A&E department are now wearing body cameras. It simply isn't right that doctors and nurses should have to go to such lengths just to feel safe at work. Will the Prime Minister join me in condemning those abhorrent attacks and say what immediate steps he will take to better protect our NHS heroes as they go about their work, treating patients and saving lives?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I join the honourable lady opposite absolutely in condemning attacks on all public servants, and particularly on NHS staff who are trying to save people and help people in their lives. And what we are doing, what we've already done, is to toughen the sentences for those who assault or who harass public servants.
We now come to Charlize Vallett, final question.
Given the recent tragic circumstances, there has inevitably been a focus on the security of members and their staff. Mr. Speaker, one aspect that is often overlooked is the fact that it is our staff who are on the front line in receiving the abusive emails and correspondence, and they take the hostile phone calls. They are private citizens, simply trying to earn a living, to put food on the table and pay for their rent or their mortgage. Yet they are caught up in this vicious cycle of venom and abuse that is directed towards us. Would my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, take this opportunity to acknowledge the fantastic work that our staff do and give them the credit that they so rightly deserve?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think that my right honourable friend spoke there for the entire House of Commons, because we all know that it is our staff, our caseworkers, our office managers who are so often in the front line, who have to deal with anger, with intemperate behaviour and with abuse, and they cope with it magnificently. We all know that the risks that they run in their daily lives, and indeed, Mr. Speaker, we've seen how some House of Commons staff have paid for their sacrifice, even with their lives. And, Mr. Speaker, I thoroughly echo and support and concur with what my honourable friend has said.
Order.
That brings us to the end of this session of Prime Minister's Questions, the first we've had in a while. As I said earlier on in the programme, it was quite sombre tributes being paid to Sir David Amess, also staff, of course, that work for MPs and James Brokenshire. Let me welcome our guests for this part of the programme, Business Minister Lee Rowley, the Shadow Treasury Minister Pat McFadden and the BBC's political editor Laura Kuenssberg. Laura, if I start with you, we've talked a lot this week about whether there is a link, direct or otherwise, between what happened to Sir David Amess, a suspected act of terrorism, and abuse online. Now, Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, definitely explored that issue through legislation that has yet to be completed or even really started properly in the House of Commons, the Online Safety Bill, and calls for toughening up that legislation. Just remind us exactly and sort of generally what it is.
That's right. So the government has already got proposals about what to do to try to make the online space a safe place for everybody and a dangerous place for those who want to do harm to other people. And it's the Online Safety Bill. The draft was put forward in April last year. And essentially, it tries to make sure that content that might be harmful for children, whether that is porn, whether it is hate speech, whether it is incitement to terrorism, really any kind of harmful content that might proliferate on the internet, is trying to come up with a system where that can be challenged, that can be taken off. Now, what it's proposing most broadly is that Ofcom, which right now is the broadcast regulator, the people who, make sure that we're all doing the right thing, they come up with codes of practice. They eventually become the regulator for what, lots of politicians would say have sort of become a Wild West, that internet space that is so much part of all of our lives, but it is so unregulated compared to lots of other things that we all consume. In the bill, it contains the power to put up some pretty hefty fines for platforms that don't remove harmful content, and it also contains the possibility of actually blocking access to some websites. But in the last week or so, quite understandably, there have been pushes and calls for that legislation that's in draft at the moment to be even tougher.
Right, and we'll look at one aspect of that in just a moment. Lee, before I come to you, Pat McFadden, Keir Starmer wanted a commitment from the Prime Minister that a certain part of the legislation would be looked at and scrutinised before Christmas, and he got that. So is that clear? You will support it as the Labour Party, the bill in its current form?
We want to support it at second reading, but to explain, that still leaves room for amendment and debate about particular parts of it. And I think there will be amendments and further votes on it. There are several stages, of course, to the parliamentary passage of any bill. But I think the events of not just the past week, but the way that public debate has been conducted, the way that politicians in all parties have been targeted by internet trolls, sometimes at the level of abuse and sometimes at the much more sinister level of real threats, has brought this to the fore. And I've got another interest in this bill, which is the question of financial fraud and online scams. And I'm looking for the bill to be strengthened in that respect too, because a lot of your viewers will find it very difficult to discern genuine adverts for financial products and so on from fraudulent ones, and this is costing people millions of pounds per year and causing enormous distress. So yes to the principle of the bill, but certainly room for amendment and debate.
Right. Before I move on to the responsibility, Lee, the bill puts the onus on Ofcom, as we heard from Laura, to potentially fine big tech companies, social media companies, for breaching the new codes of practice and also being responsible for removing that harmful content. Is it really feasible that Ofcom, the regulator here, is going to be able to take on the big legal apparatus of some of these huge, powerful companies?
Well, we hope so through this bill. The intent is that there is a general duty of care on the part of these companies to ensure that the content that's on their platforms is not transgressing things which we would assume are beyond the pale. So we're trying to work with the companies, trying to work with civil society through this period of pre-legislative scrutiny, which is what we're in at the moment, and it will go through the process that Pat has talked about in Parliament to see how we can make that work. And we've said we'll put in reserve other powers if necessary, but we want to try and find ways to make progress here, because I think everybody accepts something needs to be made progress on. How we do it is still the debate.
All right. Well, in terms of that progress, as Keir Starmer was saying, directors of companies, he would like to see directors of companies, not just the companies themselves, being criminally liable if hate speech isn't taken down. Is that something that the Prime Minister committed to? His words were, of course, Boris Johnson said, we will have criminal sanctions for those responsible for allowing this foul content to permeate the internet. Is that the same thing?
Well, over the next few months, we will come forward with exactly what we're doing. The Prime Minister has indicated that we're looking at this. We're very alive to the issue. And I know that there will be announcements in due course from my colleagues in terms of that. But if we stand back, there is already criminal sanction for those who are making the threats to life and things like that.
Sure, that's not the same thing, though, is it?
Absolutely not the same, but it can't be lost in this discussion, because that is the ultimate issue, both online and offline, how we go after these people who are making unacceptable suggestions and doing unacceptable things wherever they're doing that. And then what we have to work out is how, from a platform perspective, we can encourage and force and compel the unacceptable content to be taken down quicker or not go on in the first place.
Right. Why is it important, Pat, to actually go after the company directors or the senior management, make them criminally liable?
The reason it's important is because there's been a pattern from these social media giants of trying to wash their hands of any responsibility for the content that's posted on their platforms. And that has allowed online hatred and abuse to grow. And that's the heart of this problem, is will they show some responsibility for what's on their platform? So no one is saying that a director of the company is responsible for every post that goes up. But if those posts are really harmful, if they're drawn to the attention of that company, and if no action is taken, and that kind of atmosphere is allowed to grow, then in those cases we think there should be responsibility from the directors. So a criminal sanction will focus the minds of those who are charged with the stewardship of these companies, which so far has shirked its responsibility and allowed, as Keir Starmer said during Prime Minister's questions, a safe space for all kinds of online hatred and extremism.
But if I could just come back on that side. The challenge here is not that we don't want to do something on that, and the Online Harms Bill is intending to bring forward additional sanctions and additional compulsions to do that. It's about how we do it. And so what we've said at the moment is that we want to create this duty of care, which will encourage, force, compel companies to do the right thing, and we will keep criminal sanctions in reserve. That will be reviewed over the coming months. But we only saw last week an MP, a colleague of both of ours, had one of his speeches taken down off YouTube because presumably of an erroneous algorithm which thought it was something which it wasn't. And there's such a delicate balance to be struck here. And if we don't strike that delicate balance, we risk doing the wrong thing in the long term.
Laura?
I was just wondering, because MP after MP would give cases and examples of when something they've tried to have taken down and actually the companies have dragged their feet. And Minister, last week in the Commons, one of your colleagues on the Tory backbenches said he was so angry about this that he would like to see Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook and Jack Dorsey of Twitter dragged to the bar of the House of Commons so they could look all of you in the eye and be held accountable for the fact that they don't want to take this stuff down. They don't want to act quickly enough. And I can hear that you're trying to sort of strike a conciliatory tone and say that you want to work with them and strike the right balance. But a lot of your colleagues would say, actually, they've demonstrated that the tech companies can't sort of be trusted with the responsibility. What do you say to that?
There's no doubt that the tech companies need to do more. I mean, that's consistent across legislatures across the world where those kind of discussions have had. I was in the chamber when Marc-Francois talked about that on Monday, and there is absolutely no doubt that we see it in our jobs, and we know that all across the community people are seeing that in day-to-day lives. So it's about making sure that the companies do more and having the powers in reserve in case they decide not to.
Do you really think a system of fines is something for these massive companies, you know, mega billion-pound corporations, a system of fines of £18 million? I think that one of the suggested totals is. Do you really think that's going to be enough to change the culture?
It's about ensuring that there is an encouragement and a requirement to do it, and it is 18 million or 10% of turnover globally. So there is a significant imperative upon these companies to do that, as and when this legislation comes.
All right, so Pat, the people named by Laura, Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, Nick Clegg of Facebook, you want to see them hauled into the House of Commons to answer questions if they don't respond in the way you would like to see?
Well, I don't know about hauled. I mean...
well, never mind about the hauled, all right, wrong word, but those people, you'd like to see them in person.
Yeah, if you know, the core of your question is when parliamentary committees want to investigate these things, do I believe that the owners and the senior managers of these companies should turn up to be questioned at select committees? Yes, I do. They've got to show some responsibility. Look, these companies it's a double-edged sword. We all use them every day for what we would regard as good purposes. As MPs, we use them to communicate what we're doing to our constituents, to update our constituents on things and so on. Life's moved on from the old way, and these platforms can serve a very useful purpose. But the flip side of the coin is there is no escaping the fact that they have also been a platform for the most outrageous hatred, extremism, threats and so on, often under the cloak of anonymity with some stupid nickname and some mask or whatever that somebody thinks is clever. And my colleagues who are women MPs have received the worst of this, but it's not just MPs. We've seen footballers have it, journalists have had it. People have a right to go about their lives without this happening, nor is it just social media. The other thing that came up at Prime Minister's questions there is online extremism, which may not just be on Facebook or Twitter, but videos posted online designed to radicalise and drive people to extremist and sometimes violent views. And there's a big responsibility on that side of things, as well as the social media posts that we often talk about.
But Pat McFadden, just to be clear about exactly what Labour is saying today, the question is not just about whether or not the Zuckerbergs and Dorseys should have to give evidence to MPs if you call them for a session, isn't it? Is Labour suggesting now, if in future internet platforms do not pull their socks up and act quickly enough to remove this kind of content, you're suggesting they should be criminally responsible and potentially, you know, sent to jail? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, criminal sanctions, that's what we are suggesting.
So yes.
That they need to show some, they need quite what the sentence or the punishment would be, but criminal sanctions, yes, show some responsibility. As I say, of course there's going to be a process for drawing to people's attention material which is regarded as harmful, and the companies have got to be given a chance to respond and take it down. But if that's not done persistently, and they continue to allow the platforms that they host, or the vehicles that they host to be used for this, then we believe that that sanction should be on the statute book.
Before we move on, do you agree with that, Lee, that they should be on the statute book, that criminal sanction?
Well, we've said that it will be held in reserve. The government will review it, and it's very alive to the very tragic circumstances which have happened in recent days. But we need to do this in a careful, calm manner, which ensures that actually whatever we bring forward, and hopefully we can do that in a joint way across the House, but whatever we bring forward actually works, because we don't want to be here in 2 years' time where we're talking about how we still have as big or a bigger problem and we don't know, and it hasn't worked. We have to make law that is effective, and that's the crucial question in the coming months.
Let's talk about COVID. Earlier on in the programme, we asked our guests about whether it is time for what's called Plan B. That would include wearing masks on a mandatory basis and some of the other measures that were dropped earlier in the year. Ministers are saying no at this point. Pat McFadden, broadly speaking, Labour's position is still the same as the government's, isn't it?
We think the first emphasis should be on the vaccination effort, and I think there's a danger here that maybe we have some vaccine weariness, that the message is not getting through because we've been on this since the beginning of the year, and that would be complacent in the light of the levels of infection that we've got at the moment. Around 50,000 infections a day. We had over 200 deaths yesterday. We've got 6,000 people in hospital. So we've got to boost the vaccination effort. There are still several million adults who haven't had both their jabs. And then we've got the booster programme, which is too slow at the moment. And we've got the programme for 12 to 15-year-olds, which is also too slow. And it seems that the early impetus and momentum behind this has been somewhat dissipated.
Right.
So I think this needs booster rockets put under it to get the vaccination rates up, to get those booster and programmes for younger people up, because that is the thing that is protecting us at the moment from far greater hospitalisations and more deaths.
Do you accept that analysis around the sort of complacency? There hasn't been enough impetus, Lee, around vaccination, whether it's boosters or for younger teenagers?
No, I'm not sure I do. I think we have a long process which we've been through for the best part of a year now, trying to ensure that we have good vaccine immunity, which we do. I think something like in excess of 90% of people have COVID antibodies. We have a lot of capacity in the system. I went to visit my local vaccination centre just a few days ago. I went and had my flu jab on Friday. My parents went and got their COVID jabs the other day. You know, there's a lot of capacity there. I would very much encourage...
hasn't been as great, you know that.
And we know that the take-up hasn't yet been as high as it was earlier in the year, but it's moving. Every single day we see more people going. We are going in the right direction. But yeah, absolutely, we should encourage people to go and get that, because there are lots of jab availability.
Why not make masks mandatory in certain settings?
Because in July we said that we would, and over the summer we said that we would hold things back in case it was necessary. And if it is, we wouldn't hesitate to take that action. But whilst we don't think it is necessary, we want life to go on. We have to learn to live with this virus, and part of learning with this virus is knowing when you can live normally and when you need to make changes.
But what harm would it do, Minister? I mean, it's always so striking in the House of Commons space that you see on the Labour side, most people are still wearing masks. It's their choice. On the Conservative side, absolutely as their choice. Most people are not wearing masks. What harm would it do for more of your colleagues still to be taking that pretty simple precaution?
Well, it's ultimately down to the choice which you have highlighted. I wore a mask this morning coming in on the tube, and I will wear it again going home tonight. But equally, you know, part of government, part of the social contract is ensuring that people are able to make choices themselves and recognising that government should intervene where necessary, but it shouldn't compel where it isn't necessary.
When does that tipping point come? I mean, it's interesting. There's a big press conference this afternoon. The government will not be, moving to that plan B, as you've said, when mask wearing would be introduced again. People would be encouraged to work at home. Yet, when does the tipping point come?
And that's reviewed constantly, and we're going to see Sajid Javid come out this afternoon and talk more in more detail. But if we compare to where we are in hospitals this year compared to where we were last year, I mean, I wish there wasn't anybody in hospital with coronavirus, but it's a very different place. And we have to keep remembering that, whilst also being cognisant of the fact that if we do need to change, we will do so, but hopefully we won't.
Laura, we mentioned your tweet earlier about the press conference with Sajid Javid, the first in obviously quite a while. And even if they're not reaching for Plan B, which would also include working from home guidance, what are they going to do then?
Well, it's interesting to hear the Minister just there referring to hospital numbers. I mean, so when you talk to people in government about this moment where there are jitters, and we have heard some medics, we've heard the hospital trust this morning through the voice of the NHS Confederation. Call for things once again to be tightened up. But when you talk to people in government about it, they often point to the hospitalisation levels. So my sense is that is one of the absolute key metrics that they are looking at. I think looking at it with some degree of nerves, but also with a belief that, as we've just heard the Minister say, this is a very different situation compared to this time last year, when our viewers will well remember what happened. And many people, including many senior politicians and people who were in government at the time, believed that the Prime Minister was so reluctant to believe that restrictions would have to be reintroduced with that second lockdown, that in the end, it was a decision that came too late with all the consequences that we all know about. But this is a different situation. The population is in a different situation. Many more people have had it. Many more people, we do have fundamentally very high vaccination levels. But I think there is still a sense of trepidation at
right.
this time.
Well, and trepidation and jitters on the government side, Pat. Keir Starmer has accused Boris Johnson of characteristic complacency. Why aren't you calling for Plan B to be put in place right now?
Well, there are elements of it that you know, I think we could do.
What, working from home, mandatory masks?
Let me come to it. Plan B isn't lockdown. Plan B is several things.
That's right.
The most mild of which is wearing a mask. I mean, Lee referred to coming into Parliament on the tube this morning. I did that too, and I looked around the carriage, and I would say mask wearing on the tube train I was on this morning was about 50%.
Okay.
It's supposed to be, you know, mandatory on that. It should be.
Right.
And it should be enforced.
And what about working from home?
Well, working from home is a much bigger step than wearing a mask. So I don't think we have to do all of this at once, but we shouldn't be complacent about this. You referred to last autumn, where there was a great deal of complacency, where it all got too ideological. We ended up having a lockdown and a Christmas mess. And I think we've got to learn from that and avoid that this year. So if we have to take a step like more wearing of masks right now in the face of the infection rates, then of course we should do that.
But Pat, Labour isn't really calling for anything. I mean, as you've just explained, you're not calling for anything different. So how can you accuse the government of being complacent when you're not saying that they should change course really in any way?
Well, I don't think all this Plan B stuff would have to come in at once. I've pointed out the mask wearing. I think you could do that. I think we should be doing more on that right now, because at the moment, you know, we've called it mandatory in some places, and if you've only got half the people wearing them, then that weakens your defences against the kind of infection rates that we've got right now.
And on this idea of complacency, Lee, I mean, it's been reported that the SAGE scientists are only meeting once a month. Is that acceptable?
Well, SAGE scientists last met last week, and I accept they've gone to a different frequency. There's no doubt about that. But we have to go back to this point. I mean, Pat was talking about ideology. There is nothing ideological about people being able to live their lives. But by the same token, we have a government that is said quite clearly it's listening to its scientific advisors. It will make changes if necessary. It hopes it doesn't need to do so, and it's reviewing the situation continually. So I think we can continue living our lives in the way that we wish, taking precautions as necessary, but recognising if there is a problem, action would be taken if needed.
I'm just going to interject and interrupt for a moment, because we're going to play you some of the tributes that have been made to James Brokenshire, the Conservative MP who sadly died of lung cancer. Let's have a listen.
James was a gentleman politician, and I hope my right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, will allow me to quote her words, that politics and Parliament would be the better if there were more people of his calibre involved. And politics and Parliament are the weaker for his loss.
Anyone who got to know James, who worked with him or against him, ended up respecting him and liking him and willing him to pull through.
It's been a really sad, tragic week, really, hasn't it,
Yes,
in terms of politics in Westminster?
Yes, it has. And I think every single word of what we just heard there is true. I think every single word of what we just heard there would be agreed with by everybody who works in Westminster's strange and, you know, bubble. And I think people often forget, and I think, you know, our viewers probably don't hear this very often, but I think people sometimes forget that Westminster really is a community of people. Politicians are all human beings. They work very closely with each other, often as cross-party. You know, we heard there both Sir David Amess and James Brokenshire were liked right across the political spectrum, people with huge integrity and compassion, and who will be remembered with massive affection. And I think, you know, this place, for all its many flaws, for all its hurly-burly, actually is a place also where people feel things very deeply, and we've seen that in the last couple of weeks.
And I think we all agree with you on that point. Let's cast ahead and show you this story, BBC World tweet. Russia's Vladimir Putin will not attend the climate summit being held in Glasgow next month. Not a complete surprise, but how far does it undermine that summit, if we haven't got people like Vladimir Putin there?
We've got a lot of people coming. I don't think necessarily absolutely everybody needs to come, but ultimately the COP will be determined on its outputs and what it achieves. And we've seen good progress made on that. There's a lot of work being done by Alex Sharma and his team. So I think we should look forward to what we hope will be achieved in 3 weeks' time, rather than necessarily worrying about who gets on the flight there.
Do you agree with that, Pat?
I just want to echo, what Laura was saying about James Brokenshire there. It has been a very sad week in Parliament, and lost two of our colleagues in very different ways. And James Brokenshire was indeed very, very well liked, as was Sir David Amess on all sides. With regard to Vladimir Putin's attendance, or any world leader's attendance at COP26, of course it would be better to have the world leaders there, but the more important thing is what the outcome of the summit will be. And we need to hope for something that really does have action behind it. So I'm less interested in exactly who's attending and more interested in whether we'll get an ambitious package, and that'll be the real test of the summit in a couple of weeks' time.
Well, I'm going to break with that interest. I am quite interested in who's coming, and we're all focused now on whether the Chinese president will actually come.
Yes, and it does matter, personal attendance at these summits, for two reasons. One, the optics of these things in terms of the impression that politicians can give, which is a bit of a barometer about how seriously they're taking it, even though, as the Minister and Pat McFadden have both said, it's not everything. Of course it's not everything. But the optics do matter. But with the issue as well. And also what matters, and, we've seen this countless times at the, countless summits that I've attended, those eye-to-eye encounters between world leaders does matter. But I spoke to someone who was working for COP the other day who said what matters is who they send in their stead and whether or not they're powerful negotiators.
Well, we will find out, of course. That's all we have time for. Thank you to both my guests, Lee Rowley and Pat McFadden. From all of us here, bye-bye.